All right, what is up guys? Today I've got this 2008 Honda Civic right behind me, and this thing's got a really bad wheel bearing noise. As soon as you start driving this thing down the road, it sounds really bad. So I got this thing checked out on the lift. It needs both of the wheel bearings replaced in the front. They're both extremely noisy. So I'm gonna bring you guys over to the front of the car and I'm gonna kind of walk through the repair step by step. So let's go and take a look and see what we're looking at here. Also, it's about 1:35 in the afternoon on April the 8th, 2024, and there's supposed to be a solar eclipse going on here. We're in Katy, Texas, so definitely noticeably darker, but you can't see too much with this cloud coverage. All right, guys, so here I am. I'm on the front driver's side of the car. Now, this repair, you're gonna see as I go through it, all the steps that are involved. I'll show you guys the torque specs for everything. So step one, let's get the wheel off. I've already got it pretty much loose. It's just held on by two lug nuts right now. So take a 19mm socket, get the lug nuts off. So I'll mention to you guys real quick before we get started, I'm also, in addition to doing the wheel bearing, I'm going to be doing the lower control arm as well. I'm not really going to film that part. Right here, if you look at where the ball joint goes through the steering knuckle, see how that lower ball joint is worn. Also, the bushings in the control arm are busted too. They're torn all the way through. So I'm just showing you guys that. That way later in the video, you'll see it'll have a new control arm and you'll be wondering, what in the world, where'd that new control arm come from? But anyway, we're just gonna focus on doing the wheel bearing. So the first thing that I'm gonna wanna do, I'm gonna kind of steer it all the way to the left. And back behind here, there's these two 12mm bolts. They hold the brake caliper onto the caliper bracket. We're gonna wanna take those off, get the caliper off. That one was on there pretty tight. Probably a little too tight. Next, I'm going to remove the caliper. All right, so with the caliper off, I'm just using a brake caliper hanger, and I'm going to hang it up there on the strut, kind of out of the way, so that way it's not bothering me while I'm trying to do the rest of the work. Now, using a 17mm socket, I'm going to remove the bolts holding the brake caliper bracket onto the steering knuckle. Probably should take the pads off because the vibration is going to knock the pads off, so let me remove the pads here. Take it off. Whoops. Would help if I turn the gun up. Alright, now I'm going to remove the caliper bracket. Just a side note, anytime that you remove the caliper bracket, now would be a good time. Check your slide pins here. Make sure that they move freely, because if they're stuck or seized, yeah, like these two are good, they move freely. If they're stuck or seized, they're not moving freely, you guys are going to want to pull out those slide pins and clean them and lubricate them. Okay, next I need to remove the brake rotor. Now on this Civic, there are two Phillips head bolts that hold the rotor in place. And they really don't hold the rotor in place. Their only purpose really is to just hold the rotor onto the steering knuckle while you're assembling the pads and the caliper. What actually holds the rotor flush to the hub is when you torque the wheel. So these little bolts here, they're nice when you're assembling the brake pads, that way the rotor's not trying to fall off on you. But they can be kind of a pain in the butt when they get rusted and seized in there, and then you gotta get them out in order to get the rotor off. So pretty much anytime you're working on brakes and you see these Phillips head bolts, you're going to need a tool like this. This is the particular one that I'm using. It's a Lyle. There's the part number 29200. You can get it on Amazon or online or wherever. But you need to use this, otherwise you won't be able to get them off. All right, let's get these bolts out here. So in a situation like this, you see I hit it a bunch of times with this and it's not budging. So there's a little trick. Hit the face of the rotor almost exactly where the bolt is, hit it with a hammer. And that should be enough to jar it loose, and then we'll be able to go in with this tool and take the bolt out. Just be careful, don't hit the stud or you'll mess it up. Which I'm replacing a wheel bearing anyway, so I'll get new studs anyway, but still be careful. I'm gonna protect the studs because I don't trust myself not to hit them. All right, now let's see. All right, there we go. Let's see if this one wants to come out. All right, that one was a little bit easier. get this guy off. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna do is get this axle nut off. Now it's kind of interesting. If you look at this thing, you can see right here on the nut where somebody put the indentation, but you're supposed to put the indentation here on that little slot on the shaft. So I'm not sure exactly what happened there. If somebody probably had to take this nut off for some reason and then put it back on, and then they didn't bother hammering it down right there like they're supposed to. I'm not really sure. But ideally what you want to do is where that little hammer mark is, where somebody hammered it down, you want to try to get in there with a screwdriver or something and hammer it in there. Try to straighten that out a little bit, because when you take this nut off, you don't want that part that's pressed down gouging up your threads on the axle. All right, see, I've straightened that out a little bit. So now at this point I feel comfortable taking the nut off. Now you'll need a 32mm socket in order to get this axle nut off. I'm going to remove it using an air impact gun. But if you're using hand tools, then when you try to undo this on the lift, watch, it just kind of spins the whole axle in the hub, so you're not going to be able to take the nut off. So what you're going to want to do is take the wheel, pop the center cap off, just go in from the back side, pop that center cap out, and you're going to have to put the wheel back on, reattach the wheel, lower the car down, and then you'll be able to, at that point, loosen up the axle nut. That nut may have been over tightened too. I already did the other side, and the other side was not that tight. So either the other side was under tight or this one was over tight, I don't know. Just a side note, that's another thing that can cause wheel bearings to wear prematurely, is incorrect torque spec on the axle nut. So that's one I'm going to say, guys, when we get to that point where we're reassembling this, we got to go proper torque on the axle nut, okay? Which on this car is 134 foot-pounds. Unless you have an SI model, then it would be 180 foot-pounds, but all others are 134. Okay, next, the outer tie rod, I need to separate it from the steering knuckle, so I'm going to remove the cotter pin first of all. Oh, geez. All right, now I'm going to use a 19mm socket. Okay, next I'm going to come over here, and you'll notice right here is the ABS wheel speed sensor. So there's a 10mm bolt. I'm going to need to remove that to pull off the ABS sensor. If you forget to remove the speed sensor, then when you drive out the axle, it's going to break the speed sensor. I'm just going to tuck this speed sensor out of the way back over here. Okay, next I have to remove the two nuts and bolts that hold the steering knuckle to the strut assembly. So they're 19mm, or actually more accurately, the nuts are 19mm, but the bolt head is 17 over here. And if you see me drop a nut, it's because it's hard to do this one-handed. I'm going to slide these bolts out through the back. All right, next I can slide this whole steering knuckle out of the strut, like so. And at this point, we'll be able to shove the axle through the back side. Set the axle out of the way. Sometimes the axle may be a little bit stuck inside of the wheel hub, and then what you'll have to do is take up a punch or something with the hammer, kind of drive it out. But this one wasn't stuck at all. I don't know how well you guys will be able to hear this noise, but let's see. The other side was actually louder than this side. Now, once you remove the cotter pin from the lower ball joint, go ahead and take a 19mm socket. And break that nut loose. Okay, now a couple ways that you can get this to separate. Since I'm replacing the lower control arm anyway, I don't mind sticking a pickle fork in here and breaking it loose like that. If you do that, you'll probably damage the boot here. But like I said, I'm replacing it anyway, so I don't really care. Otherwise, you could give this a few taps with a hammer. And that one didn't take much to come off. Okay, so if you've disassembled it to this point, congratulations, because now you have the whole steering hub and knuckle removed from the vehicle, and now we'll be able to get this bearing replaced. And now this next part is going to involve, you're going to have a press in order to do the next part. There's really no way around it. So if you don't have a press, then you may have to actually just take the steering knuckle like this to a local shop and, you know, pay them 50 bucks or whatever they want to charge you to press the bearing in and out. I say 50 bucks, don't hold me to that. I'm just saying if you take this steering knuckle somewhere and they tell you they're going to charge you 300 bucks to press the bearing in and out, definitely go somewhere else. All right, now I'm going to get this whole thing over to the press and I'm going to bring the new parts and we're going to kind of go over everything, take a look and see what we need to do next. Now, as far as parts are concerned, I highly recommend that you guys buy not just the bearing, but buy the whole hub assembly with the bearing. Let me show you what I mean. So this part right here is the bearing. So this is what's grinding and making all the noise, right? But I would buy not just this, buy the kit that comes with the snap ring, comes with an axle nut, which you need to replace, and it comes with the hub itself. So a couple of benefits to doing it this way and buying the whole kit. You get all new wheel studs, so that's a big plus. Sometimes these wheel studs, they tend to break if people over tighten them, so getting all new wheel studs is a plus. The other good thing about it, and actually the main reason why I get the whole kit, is because this hub fits into this bearing like this, right? When you press out the old hub, what happens is part of the inner race of the bearing gets stuck onto the hub assembly right here. So if you're reusing the old hub, basically once you disassemble it, you'll have to cut off the inner race with a grinder and all this stuff, and it's just kind of a pain. You guys will see exactly what I mean here in a minute once I disassemble that one right there. So really all I need to disassemble this wheel bearing is a set of snap ring pliers. I'm just really going to be using these ones right here. Obviously a hammer, and I'm going to be using this 30mm socket, and you'll see why in just a second. So let me set everything up and we'll go from there. Okay, so I've got the steering knuckle set up in a vise. That's another thing you guys will need if you want to do this yourself, is a vise. A lot of people don't have that. But anyway, set it up in a vise like this. And the goal at this point is to separate the hub from the bearing. So in order to do that, I'm going to use this socket because it's the perfect diameter to fit over the wheel hub portion. So you don't want it covering the actual bearing, you just want it on the hub only. So set a socket here on the hub, and then we're just going to take a hammer and we're going to beat it out until it falls out. Usually it doesn't take any more than 4 or 5 good hits and it should come out. And that's all there is to that. So the hub is no longer there. The hub is now here on the table. And see, this is exactly what I mean. The inner race of the bearing is stuck onto the hub. So compare it to the new one, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Another reason that I would go with the kit, because if you don't, then what you're going to have to do, if you reuse this hub, you're going to have to probably take a grinder with a cutting disc, and you're going to have to cut this off and then separate it. And yeah, it's just a pain. It's a lot of wasted time. But anyway, now that that's done, we can come to the front where the wheel hub used to be, and now we can see our snap ring right there. So take your snap ring pliers and get that snap ring out. Should come out pretty easily. There we go. And that always happens. And so because the snap ring was here on top, you can see that groove where it fits right there, that groove where the snap ring fit into. And so because the snap ring was there, that means we need to press out the bearing going toward the snap ring. So in order to press the bearing out, you got to flip this over to the back and press down like that. Okay guys, so I'm over here at the press and this is my setup. So let me show you guys. So I've got the steering knuckle kind of on these plates, and the way that the plates are positioned, let me get this off and I'll show you. It's positioned with the big hole in the middle. That way, once I press the bearing out, it'll actually be able to come out the other side. And I need something to press the bearing out, so I'm using this right here. Remember guys, if you're doing this, always wear eye protection. Be careful. I'd hate to see something flying and have one of y'all get hurt, so please be careful using a press, okay? All right, here we go. There we go. Come on. Get out of there. See if I can catch it coming out. There it is. Old bearing. Okay, so check out the steering knuckle. If you look in there, you'll see the groove. Up here on the top is where the snap ring fits into. And then here on the bottom, it's got a lip. That way you can't accidentally push the bearing in too far and pop it out the other side. So when you press in the new bearing, once it's fully pressed in all the way, it'll stop. And then you'll be able to put the snap ring and be good to go. Okay, now before you go pressing in the new bearing, this is very important here. It absolutely does matter which way you put the bearing. Now let me explain. If you notice here, on this side of the bearing, this black part here, where I'm touching with the pick, this is just a seal. It's just a seal to keep dirt and stuff out from in the bearing. So you can tap on it, and it's just rubber. Over here, on this side, this is metal right here. It does have that rubber seal behind it, but this ring right here is made out of metal. This rubber seal that's here does not have the metal ring. That metal ring, you need it facing toward the axle. Now let me show you why. If I grab the outside of the bearing here and then I spin the bearing as if the car is going down the road, you see how that black ring, it spins with the inside of the bearing. It spins together. Now flip it over and let's do the same thing and watch what happens. You see how that black seal, it does not spin. It just stays stationary because it's just a dust seal. So just for a visual demonstration here. So this is the steering knuckle. There's the hole where the speed sensor comes through. So if you take the speed sensor and you put it in there, you can kind of see where it's coming out, right? So the bearing gets pressed in through the other way. So you need this tone ring right here sitting up against the speed sensor. So when it's all installed, it's going to basically be like that. That way when the wheel is spinning, this sensor, what it's doing is it's measuring how fast the wheel is spinning, and then the computer of the car converts that into miles an hour, and then you get your wheel speed. So if you put this bearing on backwards, then the speed sensor has nothing to communicate with, and you're going to get your ABS light come on. So once again, do not put the bearing backwards. Trust me, ask me how I know. Alright guys, so let me show you my setup here. So I've got the steering knuckle flipped the other way. I'm going to take the new bearing, but I'm going to start it. Make sure that the way you have this set up, you want the steering knuckle to be as level as possible because you want to try to press this thing in straight. Next, I'm going to use this because it's exactly the diameter, pretty much exactly the diameter of the bearing. You want to be pressing on the outside of the bearing. If you're pressing on the inside of the bearing, you're going to mess it up. So got to give myself a little more height here so that I don't max out the press. All right, it's going in nice and straight, so I'm just gonna keep going here until it bottoms all the way out. All right, as soon as you feel it getting tight, that's it. Go ahead and back off. Okay, now once you get the bearing pressed in all the way, we're going to go ahead and put the snap ring back on. All right, that's it for that. Just make sure that you're fully seated in the groove all the way around. And now let's take it back to the press and let's get the hub put in. Very important thing to note here though, before we start pressing this hub in, if you just take this to the press and you just, press this in like that, you're gonna have a very big problem, because what's gonna happen is that inner race, the bottom one right there, it's going to get popped out when you press this hub in. So what you're gonna wanna do is, when you press the hub in, is you need to support this inner race. You need to support it with something that's basically the same diameter. That way there's pressure here, so that when you're pressing the hub in this way, it doesn't pop that inner race of the bearing out. Because if you fail to support this bearing on the bottom side, then you're probably going to ruin the new bearing when you're pressing the hub in. Okay, so I'm ready to get the hub pressed in, and notice how I have it set up, right? So I have something on the bottom and it's putting direct pressure on the inner race of that bearing. That way when I'm pressing the hub in, it doesn't, that inner race doesn't pop out. Now we want to try to center the hub as much as possible before we start pressing it on. If it's slightly off to one side, it'll be okay. Once you start pressing it, it'll kind of straighten out, but get it as straight as you possibly can. All right, the hub's going into the bearing nicely here. So I'm just gonna keep going until it bottoms out. And as soon as I start feeling like it doesn't want to press anymore, that's enough right there. So then I'm gonna let off. Okay, that's it right there. And that's it. Everything spins nicely. Nothing is binding up. If you feel at all like this is hard to turn, or if it's binding up at any point, then you're going to want to double check your work before you install this on the car. Okay, now what I want to do here is go ahead and get this whole steering knuckle reinstalled. So I'll start by putting it over the lower ball joint. Slip it over there. I'll get that nut started real quick. Now I'm not going to go over every single torque spec on every single nut and bolt here. I'm going to go over the important ones, and then the rest of them I'll just put them in the description if you guys want to check them out. I don't want to waste too much time here going over all that. I just kind of want to cover the main points right now. So get that nut tightened down on the lower ball joint to steering knuckle. A good way to get some leverage on your ratchet is take a pry bar and stick it through one of these holes. Then you'll actually be able to tighten the nut. All right, once you get that nut tight and then you get your cotter pin reinserted, let's go ahead and get the axle shaft reinstalled through the wheel hub. Now the axle shaft, it's not coming all the way through. It's a little bit tight, but I'm not too worried about that now, because once I get the steering knuckle back into the strut assembly, then we should be able to get that axle shaft to come through a little bit more. All right, once you put some muscle into it a few times like that, as long as the axle's sticking out enough to where you can get the axle nut on a few threads like that, then that'll be fine. As you tighten the nut down, it'll pull the axle in all the way. All right, now I'm gonna get the bolts in for the strut right here. All right, let's secure the outer tie rod back to the steering knuckle here. Okay, moving on now. All right, now this axle nut on this model's got to be torqued to 134 foot-pounds. On the SI models, it's 180 foot-pounds. So because I don't want to punch out the center cap of the wheel and put the wheel on and lower it to the floor and do all that to torque it, I'm just going to do this right here. Let's go. All right, that's it. All right, now I'm gonna take a punch and a hammer. I'm gonna hammer down the lip of that axle nut into the groove on the axle shaft. That's fine right there. It is not going anywhere. Okay, next I'm gonna get my speed sensor reinstalled here. Don't over tighten this bolt or you'll snap it off in the steering knuckle, and that won't be good. Okay, next let's get the brake rotor installed here. Line up our holes for the bolts that hold the rotor on. We'll get our little Phillips head bolts in there. And don't tighten these a lot at all, just run them down snug, and that's it. Now we can come over here and get our caliper bracket reinstalled. Make sure to get those two bolts tight for the bracket, then get your brake pads reinstalled with all the hardware and everything. And now we're ready to get our brake caliper back on. Get our bolts started. I don't think that one started. Let me see here. Okay, once you get the brake caliper on, you get the two bolts tightened, then we're almost at the end here. All that's left is to get the wheel back on and get it tightened. Now when you get to this point, it's always a good idea, go around before you put the wheel on and make sure that this backing plate is not bent and touching the rotor in any location. Just come under here and take a look. A lot of times when you take this whole steering knuckle to the press, you might accidentally bend the backing plate a little bit, so just make sure it's not touching on the rotor. Otherwise, when you start driving it, you'll hear a scraping noise and you'll be trying to figure out what it is. And the last step after you get the wheel on, torque the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. Wheel lock key. All right guys, so that's pretty much it for the repair. And of course, a lot of people are probably gonna wanna know after this repair, should you do an alignment? And my opinion, yes, you should do an alignment, because when you have all that stuff off of the suspension, you put it all back together, Even though I haven't really tweaked anything as far as moving tie rods or anything like that, still things are going to be off just a little bit. So if you do this repair, I would recommend getting it aligned afterwards. But after you do that, you should be good to go. So once again, thanks for watching, and I appreciate it. I'll see you next time.